Welcome to this set of two lectures, and this happens to be the second part of this lecture on modern European history. Alongside me is Ms. Manisha Sharma, the sign language interpreter, and she would be assisting me in this lecture to make a better sense of some people. Now, Europe in the interwar period is what we are talking about, and this lecture should be made sense of alongside the first part, that is Europe in the interwar period part 1, which we just spoke about. Now, in the earlier lecture, we talked about two divergent viewpoints articulated by Lenin on the one hand in terms of socialism, and Woodrow Wilson on the other hand in terms of capitalist liberal regimes. So this is a kind of two options that the First World War opened for the statesmanly articulation by these two leaders. And we also spoke of the inability of the varying European factions engaged in the First World War to grant freedom to the colonies, mostly situated in Africa and Asia, and this had created fair degree of disillusionment and disenchantment with Western brand of politics amongst the colonies. And USSR, which is a new socialist entity in the interwar period, is finding itself supported, or in fact most of the colonies are gravitating towards the USSR, and the capitalist liberal regimes whose imagery is projected by Woodrow Wilson is discovering different ways to latch on to major countries or maximum number of countries in Europe. It tried through liberal regimes but is finding it very hard, and soon we find that most of the European countries are overtaken by dictatorial regimes. It could be left dictatorship, it could be right-wing dictatorship, and it is in this context that we also spoke of the authoritarian USSR under Lenin and Stalin subsequently, and the emergence of Nazi and fascist politics in Germany and Italy respectively, which is also spreading to several other countries in Europe. Now, in the aftermath of the World War I, Europe therefore finds itself divided along ideological line into the regimes of right or the regimes of left-wing politics, and some stuck on with the centrist politics, liberal centrist politics, and some of them either gravitated towards the left of the center, or right of the center kind of regimes. And this is the picture that we find in the decades of 1920s and 1930s in the interwar period. To begin with, Germany, France, and Britain, the three major powers in Europe, all had liberal democratic regimes, but all the three had very specific problems to tackle in the interwar period. And therefore, we find that in Germany particularly, the liberal experiment somewhat failed. So the Weimar Republic that was created in Germany in the post-First World War situation, and we all know about the unfair treatment given to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, and that is leading to a very complicated set of aspirations and resentment combined amongst the German population. And any regime, and incidentally it is the Weimar Republic in Germany, which has to to tackle this. So Weimar Republic is attempting to restore the pre-war economic status, and ultimately we find that it couldn't quite do this, and therefore gave way to the right-wing Nazism. So this is what is happening in Germany, although if you read in detail you will find that the Stresemann era, which is part of the Weimar Republic, some noticeable gains were made, particularly with reference to housing and several other sectors, but somewhat it couldn't quite withstand the pressures generated on account of the 1929 economic glut. Right, so that economic shrinkage that happened in the 1929 phase, which continued to have its impact up to 1932, 1933, was just too much for a liberal regime in Germany to handle, and eventually it is the right-wing Nazi regime that takes over under the leadership of Hitler in Germany. In Britain, the liberals were there in power, but again in the interwar period, although Britain emerged out of the First World War as triumphant power, nevertheless the expectations were rising, and the pressure on the liberal regime was very much palpable, and therefore the liberals gave way to the left of the center positioned Labour Party. So now in the interwar period, in the 1920s, 1930s, we find British politics gravitating towards Labour Party, which is more tilted towards the left of the center position and not right wing. France, yet another triumphant power that emerged out of the First World War, saw itself considerably improving its economic position in the interwar period after some very taxing kind of war reparations and other conditions that it imposed on the vanquished, that is the German power. So France had everything to gain out of the First World War, and its economic position considerably improved after the war, and yet it found itself gravitating towards right-left divide without any coalition. And if you see the French politics in the interwar period, you have some period of left-wing dominance, some period of right-wing dominance, without the two coming together to create a stable coalition that could lead France in the interwar period. So alternating power of left and right is what we get to see during the interwar period in France. Another consequence was the unprecedented economic crisis that crippled Europe and other parts of the world in 1929, the Great Depression, as we all know about it. It triggered through Wall Street collapse, to share market collapse in United States of America. But since European economy was very much connected with the US economy, therefore its reverberance was soon felt in Europe, and most of the areas that were exposed to international trade and linkage with the United States of American economy, they felt the tremors of this economic crisis in a big way. USSR, since it had a different kind of economic policies in place, which was insulated, which was detached from this politics, European linkage with United States of America and so forth. Therefore, it was somewhat immune. It escaped this crisis. It escaped the consequences of this crisis. Now, economic boom of the post-war period, exemplified by 1929 depression, economic depression, Actually, this economic boom of the post-war, that is immediately after the First World War, there is some resurgence that is registered in most of the European economies, and this led to overproduction of agricultural commodities, and the US's domination of world economy gave way to the Great Depression in 1929. So overproduction over and above the requirement, demand is not good for economy, and this and U.S. intervention as dominant partner also altered the equilibrium of the world market, and as a consequence, in 1929 you have the Great Depression. As we discussed earlier, Russia, since it remained unaffected by 1929, particularly on account of its insularity with the world trade. 1920s, therefore, emerges as a turbulent period in history of Europe. If the First World War had destroyed the foundation of 19th century Europe, the economic depression completed the process of Europe's transformation. Europe, after 1929 economic depression, had changed irreversibly. And this is a very oft repeated view that you get to see in different textbooks of history, that how First World War, closely followed by the economic depression of 1929, had completely shaken the foundation of European politics, and it changed it irreversibly. So when we say irreversibility, what it means is the trust, the faith, and the longevity with which people invested in the liberal regime, in the democratic regimes all across the 19th century European history and the early decades of 20th century European history. That trust, that faith was now shaken. Liberal regimes, liberal democratic regimes, capitalist economies had never faced this enormity of a challenge, particularly the 1929 economic depression, and resultantly it collapsed, and most of the European countries, as we discussed in the earlier part of this lecture, that they gravitated towards dictatorial regimes. It could be left-wing dictatorial regimes, it could be right-wing dictatorial regimes. And therefore, Erich Hobsbawm, the noted historian, is a leftist historian. He sees the period 1914 to 1945, the beginning of the First World War to the end of the Second World War, as the 30 Years' War. So he does not regard that there was some kind of a thaw between the two world wars. He sees it as continuum. World War I was just not able to resolve anything, and it was after 1919, the visibility might not have been there, but countries were at war with each other, and Europe continued to be turbulent, and 1929 economic depression is just an example of that. So he sees the entire period from the start of the First World War to the end of the Second World War as the 30 Years' War, since issues still remained unsolved after World War I, and therefore fascism and its following up by the World War II is what we get to see in the interwar period. The interwar period can also be seen as an attempt by various regimes to overcome this crisis, and in this context we took the example of Weimar Republic in Germany, which is a liberal politics regime, which is a liberal democratic representative politics kind of a regime, and it tried its best to overcome the turbulent times, the unfulfilled aspirations of Germans and their resentment against unfair treatment in the Treaty of Versailles and so forth. but again it couldn't quite withstand the blow registered to it through the economic depression of 1929. So what we find across countries in Europe in the interwar period is that varied solutions ranging from the radical revolutions of the left to fascism of the right is what gets unfolded in the 1930s. And certainly the liberal representative politics arena or areas where such politics were still at work was very fast shrinking, and this space is increasingly being taken over by the radical revolutions of the left as well as the fascist regimes belonging to the right-wing politics. So, liberal democracy emerged from World War I, beset with a sense of crisis, brutality, savagery of the First World War, mobilization, privation, and dislocation all over Europe, had led to some kind of a radicalization of European population. So the sedateness which is so proverbial of liberal regimes, the slow gradual legislative way of change and progress that marked liberal politics for decades across 19th and early part of 20th century, that rhythm is broken. And now it is a radicalized European population that these political regimes have to deal with. And therefore, revolutions in Russia and failed revolts in Germany and Hungary are just symptomatic of this. In England and France, the old elite model of liberal democratic politics was confronted with movements of workers, and these are industrial workers who are alienated from the social order, and also women who have now started voicing their concern and demanding the right to vote. And these are new historical factors, these are new historical agencies that are now very much present, and any political system has to deal with it. In Germany, Weimar Republic was Germany's first attempt at liberal democracy with a broad adult suffrage. Despite being crisis-ridden, it did produce some of the pioneering debates in philosophy and politics at Berlin in the 1920s. In fact, Berlin during the Weimar period had emerged as the cultural capital of Europe. France, on the other hand, pursued particularly forceful policy with respect to Germany. We all are aware of the Treaty of Versailles. It demanded severe reparations and later pursued a policy of security pacts with the states in Central and Eastern Europe, all to encircle Germany. Britain, as we discussed earlier, was most aggressive in the campaign against Russian revolution, because Russian experiment is a left-wing dictatorial experiment in the interwar period. It perceived the Russian revolution as a threat to all the liberal democracies. So even in colonies, particularly sitting here in India, we could see that Russophobia displayed by the British regime here in the colonial period. The harshness that was shown to Germany and the unwillingness to give freedom to the colonies proved, despite Wilsonian international liberalism, Lenin's assertion that the World War I was essentially a war among the imperial powers to redivide the world among themselves. So, as someone sitting in the 21st century looking at the interwar period and European situation, one can make various sense out of what transpired between the decades of 1920s and 30s and how polities catapulted in these decades, and how left dictatorship or right dictatorship emerged, and ultimately it led to Second World War. But one way that can also be meaningful is the last point that you can see on your slide, and therefore the resultant disillusionment of colonial people with Western liberalism drove them to gravitate towards Bolshevik Russia for answers, and therefore you find that immediately after independence, most of the colonies that had become decolonized are getting close to the Russian model of planned developments and so forth. So that is it for the day. Thank you.